Never thought I would use a clip from Christmas Vacation in a sermon. But after reading this story from Luke again this week, the scene kept coming to mind. After all, Aunt Bethany is right, of course. We all experience grace in different ways, depending upon the context. Yes, it's what some of us call the prayer before the meal. And for some, it's the name of a family member or friend. But it's also the way we might describe the way someone carries themselves. She moves gracefully. Or what we call that period of time we're given to make good on a payment. Yes, you've got a 10-day grace period. Had we lived in a different time, we would refer to this as royalty. Why, yes, your grace. Throughout time, it's been understood as honoring someone or something with your attendance. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. For people of faith, though, grace takes on an additional form of meaning, one that's experienced more than explained. Sure, we can put words to it like mercy or unconditional love. We can call it a gift. Say things like, there's nothing you can do to earn or deserve it. And while those descriptions are helpful, I suspect they don't fully capture the grace you've experienced in your own life. Or at least that's certainly the case for me. My grandfather was a Purple Heart from World War II. He was wounded in the Pacific on the island of Leyte. He and his platoon were attempting to take a hill as they worked their way across the island. He can remember rising up with the other soldiers around him to run up that hill that day. At one moment, he remembers being surrounded by his friends. The next, he remembers being the last man standing. It was in that moment that he was hit. The bullet entered his chest and exited down his back, coming literally inches from major organs and most certainly his death. But he lived. He was one of the few that day. In fact, he lived a long, wonderful life to the age of 88. We buried him just 2 years ago. And I often think to myself, had that bullet entered his body just a second later or earlier, just a few inches differently, one direction or the other, I would not be standing here before you today. I suppose that's the reason when I think of grace, I think of the psalmist who writes, "So teach us to count our days, that we might gain wisdom." After all, it tends to be when we're closest to death that we experience it. It's at those times of reaching a dead end that we look back and can appreciate how grace showed up and offered us new life. I got to wondering this week if the widow at Nain was ever able to see it. We aren't given many details about her specific circumstances, but at the same time, we know everything we need to know. A mother has lost her only son. So I can promise you the last thing she's thinking about is grace. Which means there isn't just one dead body in this scene, but two. It's just the one's leading the funeral processional breathing, while the other lies breathless on the bier. Luke tells us that Jesus approaches this scene and has compassion for this woman, and by merely touching the bier, the son is raised to new life and given over to his mother, who's subsequently now back from the dead herself. But what makes this story as unique is that, well, no one asks Jesus to do this. I mean, Jesus heals a lot of people in the Gospel of Luke. A woman approaches him at a dinner party and pours perfume on his feet. Another woman battles through the crowd to touch the hem of his garment. Just last Sunday, we heard the story in which a centurion sends word through his friends on behalf of his servant who's ill. Just give the word, the centurion says, and I know he'll be healed. And Jesus praises all three of these individuals and attributes their healing to their faith. But the woman in this story is different. She doesn't ask Jesus to raise her son. She doesn't fall on her knees and beg for his life. Even more, when her son comes back to life, there aren't any thank yous or words of gratitude, which we find all the time in the gospel stories about Jesus' healings. No, today's story is unique because there's no word about faith or about gratitude or about praise. Just pure, unadulterated, undiluted, unbidden, unearned, unasked for grace. Which makes sense given the mixed responses. This mother is speechless. The son is speaking, but obviously no one figures out what he says. And the people are filled with fear while simultaneously praising God. I wasn't there, but my guess is the scene was similar on the campus of Morehouse College here in Atlanta just a few weeks ago. Robert F. Smith, the CEO of Vista Equity Partners, was giving the commencement address at graduation when he told the graduates that he'd be making a gift to the college in the form of a grant to pay off the student loans of the class of 2019. The gift would be the largest ever to the college, to the tune of some $40 million. The difference between the scene in Atlanta that day and the one in Nain is that there was certainly visible gratitude and praise. I saw pictures. But there was also shock and awe. And if I were to guess, a little bit of fear. After all, this one gift changed the trajectory of everyone's life affected by it that day. Not just the students, but their families too. Tina Mitchum, who's the mother of Aaron Mitchum, one of the lucky graduates, told a local news reporter that 8 family members, including the student's 76-year-old grandmother, had co-signed on student loans over a 4-year period to make her son's dream a reality. They were looking at repaying $90,000. But in one fell swoop, student loan paying for several generations of family members was gone. She said, I know Mr. Smith told us to pay it forward, but I'm not sure we'll ever be able to repay a gift like this. And perhaps that's the hardest thing about grace. Maybe that's why there's so much mixed response in this scene at Nain. Not just that grace comes unexpectedly and changes our lives forever, but that it's something we can't ever really pay back in return. And that's uncomfortable, isn't it? I mean, we're in a transactional culture. That's just not the way the economics of things work. If you do something for someone, you expect the same in return. If you do the right things should come back to you. But grace in its most pure form, well, it has a way of turning everything upside down. And you know what I mean. When you sat down to have that hard conversation, but it turned out to be seamless, even celebratory. Or when you expected the results to be bad news, but they turned out better than anyone could have anticipated. Or when you were so convinced the answer was going to be no, you almost didn't even ask, but still today are so glad you did because the yes you received changed your life forever. I mean, when you're expecting a funeral and it turns out to be a party, that's not only hard to comprehend, quite frankly, it's hard to receive. I suppose I thought of my grandfather this week because I came across the story of another World War II vet. Some of you may have heard his story before. He was a prisoner of war at the hands of the Japanese in the 1940s. He was one of those sent to lay the so-called Railway of Death from Thailand to Burma, nearly half of whom never came home. Beaten with bamboo canes and rifle butts, kicked unconscious while lying in the dust, forced to hold a heavy drum above his head for 8 hours in the blazing sun, or he'd be kicked or prodded with a bayonet. He admitted that after the war, he hated the Japanese and anything to do with them for half a century. One day he was invited to go on a pilgrimage to Japan. The pilgrimage was organized by a group called Agape, which of course means unconditional love. The group was founded by a Japanese woman who was married to an Englishman and who had become a Christian. She had discovered in Japan a remarkable memorial, a beautifully maintained garden created by local people in memory of 16 British soldiers who had died as prisoners of war working in a copper mine. The discovery had spurred her to seek to heal the wounds of the past. Skeptical, this old gentleman went on the pilgrimage. The Japanese family he stayed with sensed his hostility. But then one day he went down for a walk by the river with two of their little girls. They were going to feed the fish. Communication, of course, was difficult because of the language barrier. But one of the girls, age 7, she knew that the old man looked unhappy. This is how he describes what happened next. He said, "I felt a little hand slide into mine. At first, I pulled away. But then I looked down and saw the smiling face of one of their daughters. And I placed my hand back in hers. And then at that instant, more than 50 years of hatred vanished. I felt this great warmth come over me. I felt so at peace. I knew I couldn't go on with such bitterness in my heart. I thought to myself, these are not the people who tortured us." He returned to the house a recognizably different person. The terrible nightmares that had dogged him for some 50 years now ceased. And 5 years later, at a celebration he addressed in London, he introduced that girl, now 12, to those gathered with these words. "I want you to meet the little girl who saved me. She healed me. Her name is Grace." Look, I don't know how it works, from whence it comes, and who gets it, and why, and when. I don't begin to believe I understand the mystery of the divine. After all, I'm all too aware that sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes things don't end well. Sometimes the dead stay dead. But sometimes you're walking down the road, consumed by grief, ridden with anger, overcome with anxiety. And grace shows up, and a friend, or family member or a complete stranger. At first, you may not recognize it. Sometimes it's hard to see, but it has the power to save us all. If only we are able to receive it.